Hey guys, what's up? It's Finch here. Today we're going to be discussing Landorus-Therian form in the SSOU tier and also just an overuse in general over the last couple of generations. So dating back to early last generation, Landorus T has been one of the most common Pokemon in the overused format, including times last generation when it was clearly number 1 in usage, and in general it was always in the top 5. It actually bottomed out near the end of the generation, but even then it was still anywhere from top 5 to top 7 in terms of usage stats and viability. The same can be said nowadays in SSOU. After a bit of a bumpy start, Landorus T gained its footing, and now it's seen as one of, if not the most common Pokemon. I believe with the slight decline in Clefable usage due to Urshifu being banned, and the uptick in the need for Cinderace checks, Regieleki checks, Zero Aura checks, etc., Landorus T has now eclipsed Clefable as being the top used Pokemon overused, in fact. And with this comes another uptick in people wondering, is Landorus-Therian broken or ban-worthy in the SSOU metagame, much like they did last generation? And last generation was a bit of an outcry of people just thinking that because it was the most common Pokemon, because it was so important, because team building really revolved around including it on your team to check so many Pokemon, it was actually unhealthy, it was actually ban-worthy. And fundamentally speaking, a Pokemon cannot be broken due to seeing too much usage. Because think about it, then you're just going to end up banning it, sure, but then all of a sudden there's another Pokemon that's the most used Pokemon. You just ban that, you just keep banning the clear-cut top used Pokemon. At what point do you stop? Is there a certain threshold? And then you have to kind of create an arbitrary line at 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50%, whatever it may be usage, until you're basically playing a watered-down variant of the tier that has eliminated common Pokemon, but not necessarily broken or restrictive Pokemon. Or rather, the Pokemon that make playing the tier possible to begin with. Because you look at the things that are used as much as they did. Look at Landorus T. Look at Hydreigon in the Spectra metagame, for example. Look at Tornadus T. Look at Slowbro. You can look at Clefable in the Urshifu metagame. They were used as much as they were, not necessarily because they were broken, although you can make separate arguments for that, but rather because they're able to do something called role compression, in that they fulfill multiple roles. Take Landorus T, for example. It could check Pokemon like Cinderace, Garchomp, Excadrill, Regieleki, Zero Aura, even opposing Landorus T potentially, depending on the sets. In addition to that, it can also fulfill the role of being your ground immune, or your electric immune, or your stealth rocker, or your defogger, or your choice scarfer, or a U-turn pivot, or a swords dance sweeper. Now, it can't do all of them at once. In fact, it can hardly do half of them at once in all honesty, but it can absolutely do multiple things at once. Role compression. Let's look at another Pokemon that might be good at role compression. Just to give you guys an example, let's look at Slowbro. Now, Slowbro can be a nice physical wall, and also it can be a pivot, and also it can be a threat with Future Sight and Teleport, and also it could be something that abuses Toxic Effects, like Common Wall, and also it could be a great teammate to offensive Pokemon due to having Teleport letting them get in. Yeah, there's some overlap between roles, and yeah, Slowbro can't always do all of those things at once due to being a bit compressed, but if you notice, it's the same dynamic, in that these Pokemon accomplish multiple things on your quote-unquote team-building checklist, as in what you are looking for when you are creating teams, when you are trying to counter the Pokemon that the tier oftentimes sees. Landorus T is arguably the most famous and perhaps at the same time infamous example of a role compression Pokemon that was a convenient fit onto both bulky offensive, balance, and offensive teams, even seeing some fringe usage on stall over the generations as well. Truth be told, Landorus T is a phenomenal Pokemon, but in my opinion, it stops there. It is just a very good Pokemon, something that may play a role in defining the metagame, but doesn't do it for the wrong reasons, does it because of its offensive and defensive presence being not only unique, but also very practical. Note that in this description, I did not once call it restricted, limiting, or something that was overpowering. It does have an offensive presence, but there are more than enough checks and counters to it. It does have a defensive presence, but there are plenty of common Pokemon that can beat it down. Especially pretty much every special attacker that is quicker than it and doesn't die to Earthquake in one shot, or even a number of physical attackers that can muscle through it, or potentially even hit it with super effective moves. Moreover, its speed tier is nothing out of this world. Yes, it is on the slightly faster end of the spectrum, but you wouldn't say it has an ungodly speed tier like something like Spectra or Tornadus-Therian does, or even Cinderace. In fact, it's pretty average, maybe slightly above average. it doesn't really have anything too crazy going for it besides a 145 attack stat. But is that really even that crazy? I mean, alone, yeah, it's the second highest in OU, right above Melmetal, and a little bit further above things like Buzzwole and Excadrill. Sure, but attacking stats don't actually mean anything. If you look, Haxorus has 147 attack, and Glastrier has 145 attack. However, they reside in RUBL and RU respectively, mainly because it's how you use it. So how does Landorus-T use its attacking stat? What sets does it use to abuse the combination of Intimidate, a good defensive typing, and 89-90 physical bulk, which alone isn't amazing, but with Intimidate actually becomes quite good? Well, it uses, in my opinion, 5 sets, really 3 of which I would call quote-unquote mainstream, that being the Stealth Rock set, which is far and away the most common set, followed by the Choice Scarf set, which can run a number of different moves, and also a Swords Dance set, but you can also see some other options on it, and also you can see Focus Sash, and other options, I mean, these are all options that you can kind of toss onto variants of the first 3, be it, knock off to move opposing items, or Rock Polish combined with Swords Dance, or Protect to gain leftovers if you don't need Stealth Rock or you don't need Toxic for some reason, or Superpower for coverage moves, hitting things like Ferrothor, getting a kill at +2, on Swords Dance sets or Charge Scarf sets. So all in all, there is some versatility in the mix of Landorus-Therian, and it has some good sets. In fact, Landorus-T has become one of the most common Stealth Rock setters in the metagame, with the combination of Stealth Rock and Toxic setting up. Stealth Rock makes it so that it could kind of force a Toxic onto things like Landorus-Therian on the opposing team, Zapdos on the opposing team, Tornadus-Therian, Moltres, etc. But it is stonewalled by Corviknight, that is true. And things like Tornadus-T, they're not taking any damage from Earthquake and very little from U-Turn, so they could still constantly defog on it. So is it necessarily an unbeatable Stealth Rocker? No. You can keep Stealth Rocks off against it, but what does make it very good are the Pokemon that it checks while being the Stealth Rocker, and the roles it compresses on the team. So again, it's very good with role compression, if you will, but it's not necessarily something that you would consider a broken Pokemon. It does a lot of things, but there's no way to quantify this and saying, okay, I believe this makes the game unfair. I have an unfair advantage when using Landorus-T. Why? Because there are still so many things that beat it. And yeah, it may check a number of common special attackers, physical attackers rather, but Blissey checks virtually every special attacker, and you don't see people complaining about it. It has teleports, you can't say it's passive. Maybe it has a bit less offensive presence, but it makes up for that in defensive presence, and a very practical one at that. I mean, look at what it did to Choice Spec Spectra, which otherwise could have just snowballed throughout the whole tier. You don't like the Blissey example because it's a bit too passive still. Okay, let's look at Slowbro. Slowbro is able to check virtually all of the same physical attackers. The ground types, the Cinderaces of the world, even potentially Landorus-T itself, not to mention it also can check things like Barraskewda. It could check things like Melmetal that you can't necessarily do with Landorus-T, Swampert, Urshifu Rapid Strike encounters, those Pokemon. So yeah, you might not be able to check electric types like Landorus-T, but that aside, you can still do so much. What really distinguishes it? They both can pivot, they both have some offensive presence. Yes, Landorus-T is a bit faster and a bit stronger, but is that really enough? Can you really draw some particularly arbitrary line, in my opinion, just between those two? There's no broken argument. There's no uncompetitive argument there. It's just Landorus-T distinguishing itself as a very practical option. Having moves like Stealth Rock, Defog, U-Turn make Pokemon very appealing to team building because those are things that you see on teams a lot. You can go even further. Things like Knockoff or Toxic plus the ability to lure in things that you want to Toxic, like Tornadus-T, like Zapdos, which again are common defoggers, so getting a strain on them can help you in your game plan. And in practice, that makes Landorus-T very good. Even moving beyond the leftovers Stealth Rock set, you can see Rocky Helmet on it sometimes. Or you could go ahead and say, I want to use Landorus-T as a speed demon. It's already very strong, as we saw before. I want to make it fast. Throw a Choice Scarf on him. That's great. Can even be an emergency button defogger, which I don't love using it in that role, but it can still work nonetheless. Stone Edge can potentially pick off a Tornadus-T with some little chip if you want to get that surprise kill. Sure, you can run Knockoff or Superpower, Explosion, even Punishment for things like Commander Uniqueless if you so please. And then there's also Swords Dance variants, which I will admit, I think Swords Dance Landorus-T is really cool. And last generation with Z-moves was actually super strong, but it never was broken. There were always checks and counters to it, and nowadays that remains the case. While it can abuse some opposing structures that rely on opposing Landorus-T for checking ground types like Landorus-T itself, which is kind of funny circular logic there, if you will. But that is how some teams are constructed, because you could sub up on it and then it can't break the sub with U-Turn, and Toxic's not doing anything, Knockoff if you have it's not going to do enough, etc. that's cool and all, but you can still revenge kill them. Things like Infiltrator Dragapult, or potentially hard stops like Tangrowth and Skarmory and Buzzwole are still relevant and see anywhere from little to decent amounts of usage in the metagame. Yeah, they're not the best Pokemon, but they're still worth noting. And on top of this, there's also the Sash lead set, which I don't think anyone in their right mind would be complaining about. Yeah, it has a strong explosion that can get up rocks, but it's basically just a suicide lead. You could go ahead and replace it with Azelf or Mew, and you would not see a large discrepancy in the result of those teams. It just gives you an emergency button check to Regieleki if you face it in the right matchup, or another ground immunity if you so please, and an emergency button Intimidate. Yeah, those are practical things, but it's really not the be-all end-all. You could build hyper-offensive teams with similar effectiveness with or without Landorus-T. It's not even considered an absolute must. You see more Mew, you see more Lead Excadrill nowadays, in all honesty. So yeah. With that said, we went over some Pokemon that we feel Landorus-T matches up well against, the aforementioned physical attackers, the ground types like Garchomp, Excadrill, and opposing Landorus-T, and then some electric types which are actually surging a bit in usage lately, Regieleki and especially Zeraora, and you're also one of the few checks in the metagame to Cinderace. If you lose Landorus-T in the metagame, all of those Pokemon get even harder. Suddenly, people start wondering, is Cinderace even more broken than I imagined? Could Scale Shark Garchomp have finally pushed it over the tide back to being Ubers for the first time since the middle of Generation 5? And so on and so forth, So not only are you removing a piece of offensive and defensive counterplay that's very relevant in the metagame, but on top of that, you're doing so when it's not really something that's overly limiting or restrictive. Like, you don't have to use multiple of these Pokemon on every single team. It's very easy to fit something like Barraskewda, Dragapult, Dragonite, which can pretty much turn Landorus-T into setup fodder depending on the set. Subholucha, Tauntaurucha, Hydreigon, Synthesis plus Sword Stance Kartana, Latios, Nidoking, Rillaboom, Tapu Lele, Swampert, Urshifu Rapid Strike, etc. It's very easy to use one. A Zapdos Glide is a huge abuser of it. One of the Pokemon that can exploit it defensively as an offensive or a mixed attacker on your team. It's very much, possible. You see it oftentimes. You don't need to use Zeraora plus Cinderace on every team, and if you do, then even then, if you force a knockoff or Toxic from Zeraora on Landorus-T, then all of a sudden Pyro Ball is a 2-hit KO after rocks a couple times, or 3-hit KO if not rocks up, and that's more than possible because Landorus-T is still responsible for getting up rocks and pivoting in each time one of those Pokemon come up, and they have heavy-duty boots equipped, and they're likely paired with something with Teleport or Slow U-Turn, and suddenly that actually tilts in favor of these Pokemon because Landorus-T doesn't have any recovery. While you lose the 1v1s in the long haul, all of a sudden the 1v1s go from 1v.5 or 1v.25 depending on Landorus-T's health, if that makes sense to you. And in addition to that, if you guys just want to look at it by the pure definition of broken or uncompetitive, which ultimately leads down the same road that we went for Urshifu and Spectre, in that it limits you in team building, in that there are no defensive counters, there's not enough offensive counterplay or revenge killers. Well, in terms of revenge killers, I didn't even make it because there are so many of them, but Dragapult can revenge kill it from a decent amount, Mixed Garchomp, Hydreigon, Life Orb Hydreigon, Kartana from a decent range of health, Latios from any range of health, Scarf Magearna if you see that, Nidoking if it's a slow Landorus-T can do it, Rillaboom with Grassy Glide can do it from a decent range, Specs Tapu Koko from half, Tapu Lele from any range of health, Tornadus-T from half or above, Urshifu Rapid Strike can, Volcarona can, I could go on. There are a ton of things that can revenge kill, and that's not even mentioning Aqua Jet users, like, again, Urshifu Rapid, Barraskewda, Azumarill, etc. Ice Shard user like Mamoswine, Weavile, The point is that it's very easy to find offensive counterplay. Landorus-T is not going to be sweeping hyper offense or even offensive teams in general. Might be getting a kill, might be able to trade, but unlike Spectrier or unlike Sucker Punch or Shifu, offensive counterplay is very much not an issue. So, are there enough defensive checks and counters to Landorus-T in the metagame? And the answer is an overwhelming yes. Skarmory and Tangrowth outright wallet if you have the right set. Tangrowth's just a standard set. Skarmory, technically speaking, Whirlwind basically makes you a counter, but if you drop Whirlwind, even then, if you have Brave Bird, or if it's not a subset, Toxic, and if it, you could run counter even, there are a lot of ways around it, and if you don't have one of those on your Skarmory set, then, that's your fault for using a poor set. Slowbro, it's not like a super foolproof counter because U-Turn can out-damage Regenerator on more offensive Landorus-T sets, but for any Rocky Helmet variant, or if you just get any chip on it, you put it in Scald range pretty much, and +2 isn't even going to kill you unless it's booming, so that's a trade, fine. Corviknight, does a trick. Tornado's T is an example of a fringe because it can wall the Stealth Rock sets very easily, especially the Stealth Rock Toxic set. But the more offensive Stone Edge sets, they can 2-hit kill you with Stone Edge. And yeah, you 2-hit kill them with Hurricane, but you gotta be careful switching in. It's more of a kind of come and go, hit and miss, kind of ease prediction type of Pokemon. That's more of a soft situational check, or even a neutral than it is a counter. But then you look at Buzzwole again, another hard counter. Yeah, Buzzwole's falling off a little bit. You go further. You got Rillaboom, easy revenge killer again, another offensive counterplay. Mandibuzz you could easily live +2 Stone Edge almost always, and Foul Play knocks that out. Rotom Wash is actually a really underrated Pokemon due to the prevalence of Cinderace and Tornadus T and Landorus T, and I think it's going to be quite good in this kind of game, and I'm glad that we're seeing it more, so that's cool. And last, but certainly not least, there's also, your own Landorus T, which the early game ritual basically Landorus T versus Landorus T or Landorus T versus Garchomp or Garchomp versus Garchomp, and they just trade Toxic on turn 1 because they're both bulky Stealth Rock sets because Cinderace, Zero, or etc. kind of forced that on you. So, yeah, all in all, to all the people saying Landorus T sees too much usage, it should be banned, it's not a sound argument if you think about it. Because if you ban the Pokemon at the top of usage, then all of a sudden the next most common Pokemon, be Garchomp or something that fulfills a totally different role, if you will, is going to be, maybe not at 40% usage of Landorus T, maybe at 35, or maybe instead of 35 at 30, but do you draw the line between there? Do you draw the line at 32.5%, at 30%, 28%? Like, where do you do? It's going to be an arbitrary line. Okay, maybe you want to ban that Pokemon too, because it's too common. So all of a sudden you start banning all the best Pokemon, but all the best Pokemon are the best Pokemon because they, they keep things in check, or they provide offensive utility. So then all of a sudden you're gutting all the common archetypes. The tier is constantly evolving, which is cool, but it's doing so with less active resources and completely unnecessary bans. When if you go through the tiering policy framework of Smogon, which predates me, predates you, etc. So like, this isn't something I made up on the fly. It's just, we don't ban things based on usage. We ban them based on what they can do, their effect in practice. And yeah, the best Pokemon are used the most in practice too, but they're not necessarily used because they're broken. Like, there's no correlation. Well, okay, there's minimal correlation between usage and banworthiness is the point. So that's like just a moot argument. So then you're like, okay, does it actually fulfill, being broken? No, it doesn't really force your hand. It doesn't really restrict you a ton. Does it actually fulfill being uncompetitive? No, it fulfills a pretty healthy dynamic. There are other Pokemon that can roll compress just as well, if not at least close to as well, and so on and so forth. So all in all, to the people that are saying Landorus T is broken and we're not banning it because we have some odd favoritism to it, like, I don't even use Landorus T very much. I think it's a cool Pokemon, but like, it's just not true. Like, we're not banning it because it's not broken. So I hope that provides some clarification. I'm reading through all these survey responses, a lot of good points, some really weird points as well. I'm sure to get you some updates on that and the Vibe Builder ranks in the near future, but I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great day, and peace out, guys. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and talk to you later. Okay, bye.